Former Secretary of State Colin Powell has died due to complications from coronavirus. He was 84 years old, and yes, he was fully vaccinated. However, he had a compromised immune system as a result of other conditions and other ailments he had. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but also more importantly, talk about his legacy and some of the things that might have been left out of the corporate media's reporting of his death. Now, Powell also had multiple myeloma, which is a cancer that forms in plasma cells and diminishes the body's immune response. So for those who might be terrified of the fact that he was fully vaccinated yet died due to COVID complications, just understand that he had other conditions that made him far more susceptible to COVID symptoms. And he was expected to get a booster shot soon. He was scheduled to get one, but he didn't make it to that appointment, of course. He passed away before he could do that. Now,
Anna, before you go on.
Sure.
So most of what we're gonna discuss is his career, because it's a super interesting one that is complicated, nuanced, good sides, both sides, bad sides to it. But on the COVID front, this is exactly why we wanted people to be vaccinated, so that they wouldn't spread COVID to people who were immunocompromised because of other complications like the cancers that they have. In this case, the cancer specifically made his immune system vulnerable. That was the type of cancer that it was, right? Well, then he is incredibly susceptible to dying from COVID, and presumably, obviously we know for a fact, a lot of people around him who are just generally speaking in the public that are Republicans say, I don't care. I don't care if this leads to a high probability that you will die. I don't wanna wear a mask, I don't wanna get a vaccine, and my wants and needs and hobbies are more important than your life. And I got a hobby called, I wear, carry around "Don't Tread on Me" flags, and I go to protests, and it's so much fun, and I pretend to be a patriot. And for that hobby, Colin Powell died.
Yeah, and honestly, the whole coronavirus pandemic, from beginning to where we are today, needlessly turned into, and I've said this a billion times, but I'll say it again, a culture war issue. It didn't need to be a culture war issue, but it became one because the powerful people in this country would want us to debate about pretty much anything other than the economic system that they created to benefit and enrich themselves while everyone else is suffering. So let's just be clear about that, okay? It didn't need to be a culture war issue, it became one, and yeah, people are dying as a result of that. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about who Colin Powell was, what his career entailed, and how complicated his past really was. Now, he was the first African-American national security advisor under President Reagan. Then he became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under both George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. And then finally, he was the first Black Secretary of State under George W. Bush. Now, this is where his career is worth getting into the details of, okay? So in a speech before the United Nations in February of 2003, Powell showed what he said was evidence from US intelligence that illustrated that the Iraqi military was misleading United Nations inspectors and concealing weapons of mass destruction, okay? That speech is probably the most important part of his career because, of course, later we discovered that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. And he later regretted giving that speech before the UN Security Council. I want to show you a snippet of it and then we'll discuss.
Hussein has pursued his ambition to dominate Iraq and the broader Middle East using the only means he knows: intimidation, coercion, and annihilation of all those who might stand in his way. For Saddam Hussein, possession of the world's most deadly weapons is the ultimate trump card, the one he must hold to fulfill his ambition. We know that Saddam Hussein is determined to keep his weapons of mass destruction. He's determined to make more. Given Saddam Hussein's history of aggression, given what we know of his grandiose plans, given what we know of his terrorist associations, and given his determination to exact revenge on those who oppose him, should we take the risk that he will not someday use these weapons at a time and a place and in a manner of his choosing, at a time when the world is in a much weaker position to respond? The United States will not and cannot run that risk to the American people. Leaving Saddam Hussein in possession of weapons of mass destruction for a few more months or years is not an option, not in a post-September 11th world.
Now, that was a pivotal speech because that was what essentially helped to persuade the international community to allow for this preemptive war in Iraq. And of course, Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. And very clearly there, he's using the fear mongering associated with 9/11 in order to create this persuasive argument in favor of the preemptive war, which by the way, ended up being a complete and utter disaster. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died as a result. And of course, inspectors later said that weapons of mass destruction did not exist in Iraq. In 2005, 2 years after Powell's speech before the UN, a government report concluded that the intelligence community was dead wrong in its claim that Iraq was holding weapons of mass destruction prior to the United States invasion.
So let me tell you the backstory, because we were on air covering every detail of that. And it shows you exactly who Colin Powell was. So his career is one of, really interesting one of strength and weakness. Strength in how he rose up. He did 2 tours in Vietnam. By the way, he was wounded twice and came out of that. Being the first black man to be National Security Advisor and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Secretary of State. That's a hell of a career. Now, that's where a lot of people will leave it, but understanding that in order to do all those things, he also had to go along to get along, right? Or vice versa. And he had to be part of the establishment. There was no one who was going to be the first black national security advisor, certainly to a Republican president, who was going to say, hey, you know what, we should stop defense spending. That's not a good idea, right? No, he was going to be in favor of defense spending until the cows came home. Whether we were going to wars or not going to wars, he was always going to tell you to increase the military budget, and the defense contractors loved Colin Powell. That's a fact. And so now people will get uncomfortable with that in Washington because they're like, no, I knew him. He was a really nice guy. I actually think that's true from what everybody says. I don't think they're all lying. Personally, I'm sure he was a terrific guy. But that doesn't excuse going along with the system that we have where we funnel almost all of our resources to defense contractors instead of to our kids, to healthcare, to education, etc.
I mean, he was working for defense contractors. Like till the very end. I mean, I don't know why anyone in Washington would be shocked and chagrined at that kind of commentary. That's what he was enmeshed in throughout his career.
No, Anna, that's exactly right. If they were real reporters, they would explain the whole context and nuance of it as we are. But that's not who they are. People in Washington know each other, like each other, and they basically support each other. The powerful protect other powerful people. That's just the reality. So when you see news, you're seeing it through the prism of power. That's how power perceives it. Okay, now here we're independent, so we tell you the truth. Now finally, from my perspective, we get to that clip that Anna showed you. Look, he did 2 things there, but then understand that it isn't about him being evil. Now, this is the second half of his career where instead of strength, he had weakness. So he knew that a lot of things he said weren't true. He certainly had a giant inclination that they weren't true, let alone the weapons of mass destruction. He talked about ties to terrorists in that clip. Colin Powell full well knew that there weren't any ties to Al-Qaeda and that Saddam Hussein opposed Al-Qaeda. He knew that for a fact. And then him talking about, Saddam could attack at any moment. You were the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and as a military expert, you thought Saddam Hussein might attack us? Well, that would be suicide. You knew he wasn't going to do that. You're talking about maybe Kuwait, but we already went through that, and he got, through you and Bush and others, he got pushed back on that. He knew he couldn't do that again. So that was also, especially given his expertise, an unmitigated lie. So let's be honest about what happened in that situation. All right, finally, why the weakness? Because everyone involved there, from Powell to Negroponte to Tenet, who you saw in the background, the CIA directors, defense directors, and etc. I should say, director of intelligence. They were all manipulated by Dick Cheney. This was Cheney and the neocons' agenda. I remember before that meeting, Colin Powell didn't really want to do that speech. And Cheney said to him, this is a compromise. Look, we're gonna drive you out if you're not part of the agenda. What you could do is you could do a mitigated, careful speech in your own language, in your own way of being careful about it. But you gotta do this speech, otherwise you're not with us. And there he was profoundly weak. And then he said to this dying day, literally, that he regretted that speech and it was a blot on his career.
Yeah,
well, he should regret it because it was filled with lies and it was filled with weakness.
Yeah, I think you're being way too generous to him, right? How he would ever buy for even a second that that was a compromise, right? I have no doubt that there was a tremendous amount of pressure for him to give that speech. That speech was the speech that helped to persuade the international community to support the United States in that preemptive war, which again became a complete and utter disaster. And look, to be fair, I'll read you his remorse, his regrets. He says, Powell later said his speech before the UN was a blot on his record and recognized that it would be a part of his legacy, adding that he regretted delivering the remarks. But that wasn't the only blot on his record. Remember, there were multiple war crimes committed under the Bush administration, including the so-called enhanced interrogation / torture, just pure torture. And he signed off on that. In fact, Cenk reported on that when an ABC News report gave the details of various Bush administration officials, including Colin Powell, signing off on it. Let's watch.
First of all, you know what's devastating? Colin Powell. He was in the meetings. We always talk about how Colin Powell, not so bad, he was against the Iraq war. Later, he wound up having objections to torture when people began to find out how bad it was, Abu Ghraib, etc. But he was in the meetings and he signed off on it personally. That's a mistake you don't recover from. So the CIA now on the detainee treatment, they would come back and say, all right, look, we have a new detainee and we need permission to go ahead and do your enhanced interrogation techniques again. And every time they take it to the principals, and Cheney, Rumsfeld, Powell, Rice, they all go, okay, go ahead and torture that detainee. And they say, oh, and we're not gonna just generally ask, we're gonna ask for all the different things that you mentioned here. Can we waterboard him? Yes, you can waterboard him. Can we, put him in freezing conditions, strip him naked, sick dogs on him, humiliate him, degrade his religion, et cetera, et cetera. Can we do all these things? Powell, check. Rice, check. Rumsfeld, check. Ashcroft, check.
So sure, you can, frame it as a tremendous weakness, but how many times do you just go along with what the war criminals ask you to do?
No, that's exactly the defining question of Colin Powell's career, and that's a shame. But that's exactly it. If you're being honest about it, and a lot of people in Washington are, and I could say a funny thing here, understandably not honest, because they knew him, they revered him, they're all part of the establishment, so they don't want to tell you the establishment starts endless wars and lies about it and does unspeakable things, and then has the media largely cover up for it. Now, you can watch other obits to Colin Powell today and see if they covered it with any degree of nuance and details that we did. Did any of them tell you that he signed off on torture? But he did. Maybe that makes you uncomfortable, but it's a fact. And so I think he did it out of weakness. Does that excuse it? Not 1%. It doesn't really matter. The bottom line is you gave that speech. Yeah, Cheney tricked you into thinking that it was a compromise, and I talked to his chief of staff, Lawrence Wilkerson, who even more regretted that speech and was very honest about it. This was a long time ago, but too late. It wasn't a compromise. It was filled with every lie there was. It did lead to the war. You were used, and you were okay with it. A person of outstanding moral character would have said, no, not on my watch. We're not going to torture people. And we're not gonna lie to get America into a war it shouldn't be in. That wasn't who Colin Powell was. Later, he again showed some courage by saying enough is enough on Republicans, and he drew the line against Trump. It's damning with faint praise, but it's true, and you should know that too. And at the very end of his life, he went further and said, that's it. After January 6th, he came out and said, I'm not even a Republican anymore. This is too much to bear. They're going in a very wrong direction here against our democracy. So you can say, such as it is, that was an act of courage. So it's a complicated story and you should know all of it. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR, so those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.